back, if you can stand up, and I will try and repeat the question in case the room can't.
My name is Martin Yeating, I'm based at Warwick. So I think both for your talks that were brilliant, and then I had kind of an eye-opening moment. So I realized actually in academia, we seem to be all legalists. So we are justified by papers and so on. So, and we will explain for both of you. So how could we respond from a Christian perspective? Because I find even as Christians, we very easily go into that and don't see that.
That's great. If one of you actually just repeat the question, you would respond.
Yeah, thank you. Is this up?
It should be, yeah.
So, to repeat the question, academia is a place that normalizes a secularized sense of legalism rather than antinomianism. I agree with that. I think that's a very dominant trait within academia because you're trying to be enough in so many different areas, and if you live within that particular meta-narrative that this is where you ground the meaning of your life, that makes academia a really exhausting place, and it doesn't surprise me that burnout is such a huge issue. And I mean, something that I've seen, so I've been teaching at Edinburgh for 11 years now, and you know, it's really hard to get an academic job. It's a pretty brutal job market, and when you're on the applicant side of particularly a permanent position at a really great university, and that carrot is dangling before you, it's very easy to think, if I get that job, if I'm the one who makes it through, it will be enough, I will be enough, and I'll be happy forever. And then once if you do make it through, you're the right person that they're looking for. Often you're not. You're the sort of compromise candidate that everyone around the table can finally agree on. That happens a lot as well. But if however it happens, you actually make it through into a permanent academic job, and you're in it for a few years, all of a sudden you will meet a lot of really jaded, cynical people, and it's not really like you imagined it to be. So I think for Christians in the academy, actually, the gospel is a very distinct resource in shaping us so that we don't think in those terms. In terms of this job must be my ultimate life satisfaction. So I am going to come back to this, so that you basically presciently intuitive what my second talk is going to be on, which is using Taylor to think about idolatry. And there's a lot that can help us as academics think through how not to be idolatrous within the academy. So I'm going to defer answering that part to them, but thank you for raising it. But I actually do think that as well as the academy having a lot of people who have the sense of I'm trying to juggle lots of small idols and be enough in lots of different areas. And the way that I'll put it this afternoon is it's like serving a lot of small household gods and civic deities. And trying to satisfy them all and work out if I've done enough on every front. The academy does also have plenty of people who take the more apocalyptic, right alongside history approach. And the academy also facilitates that. I've got my big macro reading of history, and I'm very intoxicated by knowing that I'm already on the right side and I protest the right things. And I think Taylor is right in saying that that's a particular way of being human that does starve personal virtue. It has huge potential to do that. So you will also come across people who actually just don't intuit the need for something like personal sanctification or growth in virtue or kindness, because, and I'll explain this again this afternoon, for them, the one good that they value becomes the only good. And but I don't want to give away everything this afternoon, because you have no reason to come back. It's a great set of questions.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're pointing out, the immense pressure to achieve. And a few years ago I did quite a bit of work on resilience because I wanted to help. Well, I was looking into, at Hill, where we're training people for a stressful career, which is ministry, how do you help build resilience? And a lot of the psychological, secular literature on resilience is about give people a framework. The way to build resilience is to believe that there is something transcendent, something spiritual, that you have a way of coping with failure, as you were saying, what's the story that you tell yourself to cope with that? And some of the secular psychologists are saying, Of course, we're lying to our clients when we say this. We know it's not true, but it's necessary for mental health, which is interesting in Taylor's terms. People absolutely need that framework.
All right, thank you so much. All right.
Taylor Watkins, Tyndale House. Intrigued about the way that this, what you're talking about, James, plays out within Christians, in that the modern social imaginary is the air that we breathe. In what ways and to what extent do Christians find themselves resorting to secular notions of justification and sanctification, because we're not actually living in the gospel?
I would say all the time. And this is part of Christians not thinking through their own way of constructing a Christian life. And there are lots of things like spiritual disciplines, because if you are working towards your hyper good, your thing that you hold as the good, even though you believe you are sanctified by grace, you still want to see that self-transformation. And so this is what the spiritual disciplines were for. But because a lot of modern church traditions have lost the spiritual disciplines, we put in secular disciplines itself. Am I exercising every day? Am I drinking enough water? Am I whatever it is? So I think we do just take on secular frameworks.
Yeah, agreed entirely. So again, I do plan to address this a bit in my second talk. Again, you're thinking ahead of me there in a way that's good to see, because I was trying to provoke this kind of question. Certainly, I agree that there's a huge challenge for Christians not just to swim in the water that they know, that's just there by default. And academic structures they really, this is normalized in the structures of things like career promotion, which is all about demonstrating your enoughness in categories that are objective at one level, but they're perceived by humans that are very subjective, and they force you to have a very performative sort of radical reflexivity. And in lots of universities, it takes multiple attempts for each promotion to go through, because of the nature of the beast, and you're in the belly of that beast. And that also creates a lot of jaded people, a lot of cynicism, because you're having to operate in those kinds of systems. I do think that it's helpful for Christians to have some sense of thinking through what would it look like to have a faithful presence in that system, recognizing that even if you have to jump through the same hoops formally, things like your reactions to failures and successes are both things that are shaped by the gospel. So the failure doesn't crush you, and the success also doesn't sort of inflate your ego in ways that are just being puffed up with nothing in a New Testament sense. But it's really challenging. I mean, something that I'm going to talk about this afternoon, the paper is on idolatry, is that that the more you become aware of how this works in modern culture, or the modern sense of self for Taylor, the more you realize why the world that we live in is such a place of conflict on every level, between everyone. And Taylor's way of trying to resolve this is the idea that although we're all very inarticulate about this and understanding our moral frameworks, at least if you become better at articulating the concept, naming that this is a thing and that I have one too, you might be more generous in thinking through what other people have them. So you get hopefully a little bit more peace between you and your neighbour. But he says, when you do this, it means there will be more conflict with yourself. And that there's probably a lot of wisdom in that kind of direction. But then I think to resolve the conflict with yourself, really then what you need is to be set free from idolatry, even just as an individual. So anyway, I'll touch on that more this afternoon. Thanks, it's a really good question.
Emma Cameron from UCCF. I just wondered if you could give us a worked example of how you might share the gospel with that MasterChef contestant who says, it's not me in this dish.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, great question. So I think that something that's really important to do in that context is recognize that the MasterChef contestant who just says, I didn't fail, I just didn't show them who I am, that person, if you're thinking about it with Charles Taylor and all the resources he gives, that person has an extremely inarticulate moral framework, and the person has probably never ever considered even why you might react like that. They're just, it's an autopilot setting that's been bequeathed to that person through Western culture, and it's a message that's been subtly reinforced by lots of different things in that person's life. And probably that person, well, I would be quite confident in entering conversation with that person, quite confident that I would discover that that person just thinks these are self-evidently obvious ways to be. Like, this is the normal reaction, this is common sense, or this is just the way things are. And that person is probably quite siloed in thinking that Western ways of being are just universal. So if you want to share the gospel with that kind of a person, it's a very helpful preparatory approach to make that person a bit more self-aware in the first place. That, hey, do you know what's really interesting? That you think that your standard of goodness is just inherent to yourself, and that even your failures in life don't challenge your notion that you are good. Isn't it interesting that the chef at the next station failed, and you can see that this person sees the world different to you and thinks they deserve to go home, and you think you deserve to stay even though you failed. Why might that be? And why isn't your way of dealing with the situation intuitive to that other person? So the sort of background to thinking about all of this is really what Paul says in 1 Corinthians, in the first couple of chapters, about how responses to the gospel and objections to it are always enculturated, rather than completely universal wherever you go. So Paul's way of approaching it when he's sharing the gospel with Jews and with Greeks is that they have different responses. To one group it's folly, and to another group it is a stumbling block. One group asks for signs, and the other seeks wisdom. So they have very different philosophical intuitions, and yet the same gospel is Paul's message for them both. But in order for Paul to share it with them, he recognizes that they have different starting points, and therefore different, in tailoring kind of terms, different frameworks of plausibility. And I think what's really helpful with Western people who assume that their framework of the gospel is implausible, it's really helpful to help them see that that's implausible to you based on where you're from. But let's say you've been born in Indonesia, or you've been born in South Korea, or you've been born in Saudi Arabia. The things that you currently find objectionable as a Western person or counterintuitive would be the opposite. And you'd be a completely different person, and you'd be responding to the gospel in a different way, and what you currently think is counterintuitive would be intuitive to you. So how do you know that it's really such a huge obstacle to the gospel? So what I would want to do in that kind of MasterChef situation, if they ever want to bring me on as a spiritual consultant for the show, probably not going to happen. But I think even that example what you're trying to do is help the person become more self-aware in thinking, oh, so my objections are local. They're not actually compelling to all people everywhere. And you're just trying to prompt thought, I suppose, and self-awareness. And that's what I try and do a lot in the context that I preach in, for example, in Edinburgh. So I'm an elder in a congregation. It's quite a weird but amazing church, and it's a bilingual English-Spanish church, which is not what you expect normally in Edinburgh, but we have about 30,000 Spanish speakers. So a lot of the people there are Latinos, and then you have a lot of British people. And what you have on hand immediately is two very different ways of inhabiting the world, because our Spanish speakers are mostly from Latin America, and they're just not Western, and they have a really different set of intuitions, and also different stumbling blocks or different objections culturally to the gospel than the Western people. And we have new Westernized people who are there every week who are visiting, they're curious, and you actually have real people in the room where you can say, hey, your way of responding to this isn't the way that even everyone in this room responds to it. And if you were if you'd grown up in Latin America, you might not even think this. You would have different ideas. So let's look at how the gospel addresses your local concerns, but not universal ones. So it's a very long-winded way to say that. But try and do something like that with the MasterChef contestant. Just prompt thought even, as a way that might create some openness for the gospel.
Just a small tactical point. if it's possible, if it is true, it can be useful to express all of that by saying, no, I used to think that way, but then I realised such and such, and now I think a different way. If you can put it in a personal narrative, that can often bring people's barriers down.
All right, we have about 5 minutes left for questions. Yes, I see a hand right there.
What are the biggest critiques that you found towards Charles Taylor's work, particularly from a non-Christian perspective, and how have you responded to those critiques?
So the question is, what are the biggest non-Christian critiques of Charles Taylor?
Non-Christian particularly,
That's a really good question. I have to go and think about that, really. So what I see in terms of popular level critique is I'm sympathetic to. So it's a critique that says Charles Taylor became trendy, and he gets reduced to buzzwords like buffer itself or imminent frame, and all of a sudden you have people with quite watered down Taylor style moves to make in conversations. And so I've come across quite a lot of critique just in talking to other academics where they're not very sympathetic to him, but because of I suppose the sort of simplified reception of Taylor, where he becomes a sort of an easy apologetic tool or something like that. But in terms of engagement with his work itself, I think that his work is just so expansive that people who are really serious wanting to read him in order to critique him just have a huge task on their hands. It's not like I was saying at the beginning, it's not really bounded work, and it's also not turgid. He's not trying to squeeze a huge amount into a tiny space. He just has huge open parameters in order to look at a particular object in terms of the modern Western self. So you can find critical scholarship on him where people are. This afternoon we're going to be talking about his idea of hypergates, which is, I think, his way of talking about idolatry. So there's a guy who else out this afternoon who will get right into the weeds and the nuts and bolts and just say this idea he doesn't think it works because there are just too many moving pieces of the puzzle. And to get something useful from Taylor, you have to do a lot of work with him to sort of remedy some of his ideas. So there are people like that, but certainly, I suppose a lot of the thinking I've done has been particularly Protestant readers of Taylor and engaging with him because he's a Roman Catholic, that philosopher, for example. Yeah, I shall go away and do some more reading and thinking about specifically non-Christian critiques. Thanks for the talk.
I've just found there aren't really non-Christian critiques that I've come across. It's just, what is this guy going on about? This is just too vague, and I don't like this idea of objective role frame, so I'm not even going to engage with it, that kind of reaction.
Yeah, true. So I think at one point in Sources of the Self, he identifies, and this might be helpful in explaining the missing space there of non-Christian critiques. So at one point in Sources of the Self, he identifies particularly errant notion of the self that gets generated at one point in this development. And it's what he calls the neutral or the punctual self. And that's the person who thinks, I don't exist within any framework, I just am. I have this inherent sense of identity and I just have to tap into it. It's not culturally affected, it's my true self. And I just make an inward turn and it's just there waiting to be, again, for its epiphany to be revealed. And it's interesting to revisit this 35 years after he wrote that, because that neutral self has a pretty huge force in Western public discussions. So I think, if you compare, for example, intrasecular debates between gender-critical people and pro-trans thinkers, one side of that debate very much holds to something like a neutral or punctual self ideal, that regardless of your body or your culture, that there's a culturally untouched self within there, and you just have to learn to tap into it, and that's the real you. And it's in no sense a culturally mediated product. It's just like aboriginal to yourself. And And when Taylor's going through the whole book, across all these pages, that's just something that he mentions at one page and just says, this is a problem and it's generated by modernity. But I think, if you were rewriting it today, might that be a much more prominent discussion? Probably. But if you're committed to that kind of an idea, the kind of disincentive you have to take Taylor seriously, because it requires a sort of transvaluation of all of your values and a completely different sense of self. Given the dominance of, or the huge growth in a neutral or functional sense of self, that's probably not very auspicious for non-Christian engagement with Taylor in the first place. He would just push you into a completely different conversation and set of values.